The account of Violet Mercer does not begin with a scream, but with a silence. It is a story etched into the margins of parish records and the hushed recollections of a town that wished to forget. In the year 1851, long before the asylum walls were raised to contain such mysteries, a young girl's mind became a vessel for whispers that had no earthly source. The documentation suggests not a haunting of a house, but of a soul, a possession so intimate that it wore the face of the possessed and spoke with a voice that was not her own, yet originated from deep within her. What follows is not a tale of ghosts, but of the terror that blooms when the mind itself becomes a locked room with a stranger inside. If these chronicles of the unseen call to your quietest curiosities, and you are new to this archive, consider subscribing to ensure your place among us as we unseal the next file. Violet was a child of 7 years, known in the small, tightly knit community for a peculiar and quiet joy. Her father, Phineas, a man who worked with his hands and trusted only what they could hold, often remarked that his daughter found more wonder in the frost patterns on a winter window pane than other children found in a town fair. This was her one, simple, humanizing detail, a capacity for profound contentment in the smallest of things. She did not require grand events to feel the world's gentle magic. The dance of dust motes in a sunbeam, the intricate geography of a snail's shell, the silent conversation between the wind and the tall grasses behind her home, these were the things that held her rapt. Her laughter, when it came, was not a raucous explosion but a soft, melodic cascade, a sound that seemed to belong to the tranquil world she so carefully observed. It was a sound her mother, Elara, cherished above all others, a confirmation that despite the harshness of their lives, they had managed to cultivate something gentle and unspoiled. The Mercer homestead sat at the edge of the township, where the cultivated land gave way to the untamed patience of the woods. The yard behind the house was a small, contested territory of worn grass, a few determined wildflowers, and the ever-present shadow of the forest tree line. It was here, in the late summer of 1851, that the first irregularity was observed. The day was unremarkable, steeped in the thick, golden light of a waning afternoon. The air, heavy with the scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke, carried the shouts and laughter of a half-dozen children engaged in a game of tag. Violet was among them, her small form a blur of motion, her face flushed with the simple exertion of play. Her laughter, that soft and pleasing sound, rose and fell with the rhythm of the game. Her parents watched from the kitchen window, their hands momentarily stilled from their chores, a shared, unspoken satisfaction passing between them. Then it happened. It was not a grand or dramatic event. There was no stumble, no cry of pain. In the middle of a joyful sprint across the yard, Violet simply stopped. Her momentum ceased so abruptly that it seemed as if a physical, unseen hand had reached out and held her fast. The laughter died on her lips, not fading away but being cut off, like a snuffed candle flame. She stood perfectly still in the center of the yard, her body frozen mid-stride, one foot poised slightly before the other. The other children, their own games momentarily interrupted by the sudden void in their soundscape, slowed to a walk, turning to look at her. Her head was cocked to one side, a gesture of intense, focused listening. Her eyes, which moments before had been bright with the thrill of the chase, were now unfocused, their gaze turned inward, fixed upon a landscape no one else could perceive. The faint, pleasant smile remained etched on her face, but it was no longer connected to the world around her. It was a static, vacant thing. The silence she created was profound. It was more than the mere absence of her laughter. It was an active, heavy stillness that seemed to suck the very air from the yard. The other children, their own voices now hushed, stared at her with the frank, unblinking curiosity of the young. One of them, a boy named Jebediah, took a hesitant step toward her, his own name half formed on his lips, but he stopped, held back by an instinct he could not name. There was an invisible perimeter around Violet, a sacred or profane space that felt dangerous to enter. The sun continued to shine, the leaves on the distant trees continued to rustle, but in the small patch of worn grass where Violet stood, time itself seemed to have paused. She was no longer a participant in their world, but an observer of another. From the kitchen window, Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She saw her daughter's strange posture, the unnerving stillness. Phineas beside her, however, offered a simple, reassuring explanation. He said the girl was merely daydreaming, lost in one of her worlds. He spoke of her vivid imagination, a thing to be treasured, not feared. Elara wanted to believe him. She clung to the rational texture of his words, the solid, dependable weight of his certainty. And so, she nodded, forcing a smile, and turned back to the warmth of the kitchen, pushing the image of her frozen child from her mind. After a few moments that stretched into an eternity for those who watched, Violet blinked. Her body relaxed, her posture softened, and she looked around as if waking from a brief, deep sleep. She offered a small, confused smile to the other children who were still staring at her, and then, without a word, she resumed her play. The moment was broken. The children, their short attention spans quickly reasserting themselves, shrugged off the strangeness and returned to their game. The sounds of their shouts and laughter once more filled the afternoon air. But a tear had been made in the fabric of the day. The memory of her unnatural stillness lingered, a subtle poison in the otherwise sweet air. Elara, despite her best efforts to focus on her work, found her gaze repeatedly drawn back to the window, searching for any sign of a recurrence, her heart now a vigilant, anxious sentinel. The incident was the first of its kind, a single, dissonant note in the quiet symphony of their lives. It was easy enough to dismiss, to file away under the heading of childhood eccentricity. But it was a beginning. It was the first time the voices had commanded her absolute, undivided attention, pulling her out of the shared world of sunlight and games and into their own private, shadowed domain. In the weeks that followed, the pauses became more frequent, though never again so public or so dramatic. They were subtler now, woven into the quiet moments of her life. During supper, her fork would hover halfway to her mouth, her chewing slowing to a stop as her gaze drifted towards a darkened corner of the room. Her parents would call her name, once, twice, and on the third call she would start, blinking, a flicker of confusion in her eyes, before resuming her meal as if nothing had happened. They noticed her muttering to herself, a soft, continuous whisper that was always just below the threshold of intelligibility. It was not the clear, deliberate speech of a child talking to a doll or an imaginary friend. It was a quieter, more secretive sound, the sibilant rustle of dry leaves skittering across stone. When they asked her who she was talking to, she would simply shake her head and fall silent, a guarded expression closing over her features. Phineas, a man of practical solutions, tried to address the matter directly. He told her it was impolite to mumble and that she should speak her mind plainly. He spoke with the firm but gentle authority of a father who believed any problem could be solved with clear instruction and common sense. Violet would nod, her eyes downcast, and for a day or two, the muttering would cease. But it always returned, creeping back in the quiet hours when she thought no one was listening. Elara's approach was different. She tried to coax the reasons from her daughter, her voice soft with concern. She asked Violet if she was lonely, if she wanted a new doll to talk to, if there were secrets she was afraid to share. But Violet offered no explanation. She seemed incapable of articulating what was happening to her. She would only say that she was listening. When pressed further about what she was listening to, she would grow agitated, her small hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. She would insist that it was nothing, just a sound, like the wind in the chimney or the creaking of the floorboards. Her parents chose to believe her, for the alternative was too unsettling to contemplate. They constructed a narrative of benign fantasy, a story they told themselves and each other to keep the rising tide of fear at bay. They concluded that she was a solitary child with an overactive imagination, creating a world for herself that was richer and more complex than their own. They reasoned that her whispers were the nascent stories of this inner world, the private dialogues of characters only she could see. This explanation was a comfort, a sturdy wall built against the encroaching strangeness. But at night, when the house was settled into a deep and profound quiet, their carefully constructed reassurances began to crumble. From their own bed, they could hear the faint, rhythmic murmur of Violet's voice from her room down the hall. It was a sound that should have been comforting, a sign of their daughter safe in her bed, but it was not. The first time they consciously listened, they lay side by side in the darkness, each feigning sleep, each acutely aware of the other's strained, silent attention. The sound was faint, a mere vibration in the stillness of the house. It was not the monologue of a child talking in her sleep. There were distinct pauses, measured gaps in the flow of her whispered words. It was a conversation. She would murmur for a time, her tone soft and placid, and then she would fall silent, as if waiting for a reply. After a moment of complete quiet, the murmuring would begin again, this time with a slightly different inflection, as if in response to something that had been said in the intervening silence. It was the unmistakable cadence of dialogue, a back-and-forth exchange with an unheard partner. The chilling reality of it settled upon them, a cold, heavy blanket in the darkness of their room. Their daughter was not talking to herself. She was talking to someone else, someone who was in that room with her, whose voice was so quiet that only she could hear it. Phineas, his pragmatism warring with a primal fear, eventually rose from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He crept down the narrow hallway, the old floorboards groaning under his weight, each sound an explosion in the oppressive silence. He pressed his ear to the solid wood of her bedroom door, his breath held tight in his chest. On the other side, he could hear her more clearly now. The words were still indistinct, a seamless, flowing current of sound, but the conversational pattern was undeniable. He could discern no distress in her tone. It was calm, even, the sound of a simple, unremarkable discussion. This lack of fear somehow made it worse. Whatever she was communing with, it was not something she perceived as a threat. It was familiar to her. After several long minutes of listening to the one-sided conversation, he returned to his own room, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight filtering through the window. He did not need to speak. Alara saw the answer in his eyes. He told her that it was nothing, just the girl talking in her sleep, but his voice lacked conviction. The lie was a thin, brittle thing, and it shattered in the silence between them. From that night forward, a new tension entered the household. The days remained superficially the same, filled with the familiar routines of work and school and meals. But the nights became a time of anxious vigil. They would lie awake for hours, straining to hear the faint sounds from their daughter's room, a new and terrible ritual that replaced the easy comfort of sleep. The voices, or rather, Violet's response to them, became a constant, invisible presence in their home. They were a third party in their family, an unseen guest at their dinner table, a silent observer in every room. It was during this period that Violet first tried to describe the experience. It was a rare occasion, a moment of unusual clarity. She was sitting with her mother, mending a tear in her dress, when she suddenly looked up, her expression serious and her eyes focused. She told her mother that the sounds were like water. She said they were like the dripping of water in a deep, closed room, a place where there was no light. Each word, she explained, was like a single drop, and it carried an echo. She could not always understand what the drops were saying, but she could feel them. She said they were cold. She spoke of the sound not as something she heard with her ears, but as something she felt inside her head, a pressure building behind her eyes, a faint, persistent vibration in the bones of her skull. It was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the louder noises of the waking world. When the world was loud, with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer or the chatter of the market, she could almost ignore it. But in the quiet moments, in the stillness of her room or the hushed reverence of the church, the dripping would become the only sound in existence, a steady, relentless rhythm that demanded her attention. Alara listened, her heart aching with a mixture of pity and terror. She held her daughter's small hand, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness of the world Violet was describing. She tried to offer comfort, to provide a rational explanation. She spoke of the way the blood sounds in one's own ears in a quiet room, of the tricks the mind can play, but she saw in Violet's eyes that her words were meaningless. Her daughter was not describing a trick of the mind. She was describing a reality, a tangible, sensory experience that was as real to her as the feel of the needle in her hand or the warmth of her mother's touch. The conversation ended as abruptly as it began. Violet fell silent, her focus returning to her mending, leaving Alara alone with the chilling implications of her words. The image of a cold, dark, dripping room took root in her imagination, a metaphor for her daughter's increasingly isolated mind. The whispers had begun as a faint, almost innocent curiosity, a child's strange habit, but they were no longer innocent. They were a persistent, growing presence, an invasive force that was slowly and methodically severing the tethers that bound her daughter to the shared, sunlit world. The faint murmurs of her early childhood were not fading as they should have. They were solidifying, gathering weight and intention, preparing to speak in a voice that would soon become impossible for anyone to ignore. By the time Violet reached the age of 9, the faint, aquatic murmurs of her early childhood had coalesced into a more constant and insistent current. The metaphorical dripping of water in a distant room had given way to the sound of a steady, flowing stream, an underground river that ran perpetually through the landscape of her mind. This progression was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping tide, rising so incrementally that her parents, Phineas and Alara, found themselves unable to pinpoint the exact moment when concern had curdled into genuine fear. The change was most apparent in her interactions with the world beyond their homestead. The quiet joy that had once defined her had been replaced by a profound and unnerving distraction. She was a ship whose anchor had been cut, drifting on a current no one else could see or feel. Her withdrawal was first made manifest in the small, one-room schoolhouse that served the township's children. It was a place of rigid order, governed by the unyielding authority of a spinster named Prudence, a woman who believed that knowledge was best imparted through rote memorization and unwavering discipline. The schoolroom itself was a sensory world of its own, the sharp, mineral scent of chalk dust, the sweet, cloying smell of ink in small glass wells, the pervasive aroma of oiled floorboards, and the damp wool of children's coats. For most, it was a place of tedious but necessary ritual. For Violet, it became a crucible. She had once been a competent, if quiet, student, her handwriting neat and her sums accurate. But now, she struggled to remain present, her attention, once a focused beam of light, was now a scattered, diffuse glow. She no longer joined the other girls in their games of hopscotch or jacks during the midday recess. Instead, she would seek out the forgotten corners of the schoolyard, the spaces where the grass grew long and unkempt against the cold stone foundation of the building. There, she would stand for long stretches, her back to the boisterous activity of her peers, her head tilted in that now familiar listening posture. Her lips would move, forming silent words in response to the unheard colloquy that consumed her. The other children, with the unrefined cruelty of their age, began to notice. They fell silent as they passed her, their games momentarily forgotten. They would gather in small, whispering clusters, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They gave her a wide berth, as if her strangeness were a contagion that might be caught through proximity. The invisible perimeter of stillness that had first formed around her in her own yard 2 years prior had now become a permanent, recognized boundary. Inside the classroom, the situation was no better. Prudence, a woman with little patience for what she considered to be flights of fancy, grew increasingly exasperated with Violet's inattentiveness. On one particularly cold autumn morning, the lesson was on geography. The names of distant cities and rivers filled the air, a monotonous drone from the teacher's lips. Violet was seated near the back of the room, her gaze fixed not on the pull-down map at the front, but on the corner of the ceiling, where a cobweb, ancient and laden with dust, trembled in an imperceptible draft. Her lips were moving, a faint, rhythmic whisper that was barely audible beneath the teacher's lecture. Prudence stopped mid-sentence. The abrupt silence was a shock, causing every child to sit up straighter. The teacher's sharp, pointed question of what capital was located on the Tiber River was directed at Violet. The girl did not respond. She did not seem to hear. She was utterly absorbed in her silent conversation with the corner of the room. The teacher repeated the question, her voice louder now, edged with an impatient, metallic sharpness. A few of the children giggled, a nervous, suppressed sound. Still, Violet did not stir. Finally, Prudence strode down the aisle, her hard-soled shoes making a sharp, angry sound on the wooden floor. She rapped her ruler on the surface of Violet's small desk, a crack that made the girl jump. Violet blinked, her eyes clearing as she was wrenched back into the shared reality of the classroom. She looked up at the teacher, her expression one of pure, unadulterated confusion, as if she had been roused from a deep and profound sleep. She had no answer. She did not even seem to understand the question. The teacher's stern declaration that the girl's head was filled with nothing but wool and cobwebs was met with another wave of stifled laughter from the other students. For the rest of the day, Violet remained silent, her eyes fixed on her desk, a wall of shame and isolation rising around her. The incident was a turning point. From that day on, she was no longer just Violet Mercer. She was the strange Mercer girl, the one who whispered to corners. At home, her parents' attempts to reclaim her became a desperate, painful cycle of failed strategies. Elara, her heart heavy with a sorrow she could not name, tried to tether her daughter to the tangible world through gentle persistence. She would draw Violet into the kitchen, the warmest and most vital room in the house, a space filled with the grounding smells of baking bread and drying herbs. She would give Violet simple, repetitive tasks, hoping the physical actions would occupy her mind and crowd out the whispers. She instructed her to knead dough, to shell peas, to churn butter. For a time, it would seem to work. Violet's hands would move with a practiced, steady rhythm, her focus apparently on the task before her. Elara would allow herself a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that the daughter she knew was still present, just beneath the surface. But the reprieve was always temporary. Inevitably, Violet's hands would slow, her movements becoming automatic and disconnected. The kneading would cease, her hands resting motionless in the soft, pale dough. Her gaze would drift to the window, to a point in the middle distance, and her lips would begin their silent, secret work. Elara would watch, her own hands frozen, her brief hope collapsing into a familiar, aching despair. She felt as though she were trying to hold on to smoke. Phineas, whose fear was increasingly alloyed with frustration, took a different approach. His world was one of cause and effect, of problems that could be solved with strength and determination. He could not accept that his daughter's affliction was beyond his control. He interpreted her withdrawal not as a symptom of some internal siege, but as a willful act of disobedience, a stubborn refusal to engage with the world. He tried to impose order through discipline. He forbade the whispering, telling her in a stern voice that such behavior was unseemly and would not be tolerated in his house. When that failed, he assigned her more arduous chores, believing that physical exhaustion would leave no room in her mind for idle fancies. He sent her to fetch water from the well until her arms ached, to chop kindling until her hands were raw. He wanted to believe that he could physically expel the strangeness from her, that he could sweat it out of her pores. But the voices were not subject to his authority. They were an internal weather system, impervious to the commands of an external god. His sternness only served to drive Violet deeper into her secret world. She did not cry or protest. She simply grew more opaque, her face becoming a smooth, unreadable mask. She performed the tasks assigned to her with a silent, detached obedience, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Phineas's frustration mounted, occasionally boiling over into a raised voice, a sound that was rare in the Mercer household. He would demand to know who she was talking to, what was so important that she would ignore her own father. His questions were a desperate, angry barrage against a locked door. Violet would only look at him with a flat, empty gaze, offering no answers. The silence that met his anger was more infuriating than any argument. It was a confirmation of his powerlessness, a quiet, damning testament to the fact that he had lost all influence over his own child. He was no longer the primary authority in her life. That position had been usurped by the unseen occupants of her mind. The nightly conversations, once a faint and disturbing murmur, had by now evolved into a full and undeniable performance. The darkness in the hallway outside Violet's room became a kind of confessional for her parents, a place where they bore witness to the full extent of her estrangement. They would take turns standing there, the cold of the floor seeping into their bare feet, their ears pressed against the unyielding wood of her door. The candle they held would cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the familiar contours of their home into a landscape of menacing shapes. The atmosphere on those nights was thick with a tension that was almost physical. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath, listening along with them. What they heard through the door was no longer just the placid cadence of dialogue. It was a full spectrum of emotion. Some nights, they would hear Violet's voice rise in what sounded like a heated argument. The whispers would become sharp, clipped, and angry. There would be long, fraught silences, and then another volley of sibilant, indecipherable words. On other nights, more disturbingly, they heard her laugh. It was not her old, melodic laughter, the sound they so cherished. This was a different sound entirely, a quiet, conspiratorial chuckle that seemed to be shared with another. It was a sound of intimacy, of a secret joke told and received in the darkness. It was this sound, more than the arguments, that chilled them to the bone. It suggested that her relationship with the voices was not one of torment, but of companionship. She was not a victim. She was a willing participant. One night, Phineas could endure it no longer. He had been listening for nearly an hour to a particularly animated, one-sided conversation. He heard Violet's voice rise and fall with an earnest, pleading quality. He could not bear the image of his daughter in her bed, begging an empty room for something he could not provide. Driven by a desperate, impulsive need to confront the void she was addressing, he pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, a loud, protesting sound in the stillness. The scene that met his eyes was one of stark and haunting simplicity. The room was bathed in the cold, silver light of a full moon, which streamed through the single window. Violet was not lying down. She was sitting bolt upright in the center of her small bed, her legs crossed beneath her thin nightdress. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and her face was turned towards the foot of the bed, where the moonlight pooled on the floor, creating an empty, illuminated stage. She was in the middle of speaking, her lips forming a word that was cut off by his sudden entrance. She turned her head slowly to look at him, her eyes adjusting to the faint candlelight from the hallway. There was no fear in her expression. There was no surprise, no guilt at having been discovered. Instead, her face was contorted with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. Her eyes, which in the moonlight seemed almost black, blazed with a resentment so profound it made Phineas take an involuntary step back. It was the look of someone whose most sacred and private ritual had been violated. She did not say a word. She simply stared at him, her small body radiating an almost palpable wave of animosity. He had expected to find her afraid, or perhaps lost in a trance. He had been prepared to comfort her, to hold her, to pull her back from the brink of whatever madness was claiming her. He was not prepared for her anger. He had burst into the room to save her from the unseen, only to find that she viewed him as the intruder, the unwelcome ghost in her sanctum. He stood there for a long moment, frozen in the doorway, the candle in his hand trembling. Then, without a word, he backed out of the room, pulling the door closed, the soft click of the latch sounding like a final, definitive judgment. He knew then that the problem was far worse than he had imagined. She was not just listening to the voices, she was protecting them. The family's strange ordeal could not remain contained within the walls of their home. The seeds of gossip planted at the schoolhouse had taken root in the fertile soil of the small community. Whispers followed Phineas when he went to the general store to purchase supplies. Conversations among the townswomen would fall silent when Alara passed by. The Mercers, once respected, if quiet, members of the community, were now regarded with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Neighbors who had once shared a fence line and friendly conversation now offered only curt nods, their eyes quickly averting. The town's collective imagination, starved for drama, began to weave its own narrative around the strange Mercer girl. Some said she was touched by a fever that had settled in her brain. Others, of a more superstitious bent, spoke of curses, of old sins of the family coming home to roost. The word unnatural was used most often, a vague but powerful condemnation that covered a multitude of fears. The Mercers' isolation became a mirror of their daughters. They were a family adrift, cut off from the mainland of normal society. The pressure of this unspoken ostracism was immense. It added a layer of public shame to their private terror. They felt the weight of 100 watching eyes, the sting of 100 whispered judgments. Their home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a besieged fortress. This external pressure, combined with the escalating horror within, finally broke them. They realized, with a shared and unspoken certainty, that their own love, their own reason, their own discipline were utterly inadequate to combat the force that was consuming their daughter. They were out of their depth, drowning in a mystery too profound for them to solve alone. It was time to turn to a higher authority, to seek out the men of science and the men of God, in a desperate hope that either medicine or faith could provide a name for the darkness that had taken up residence in their child. The decision to seek external help was not made in the clear light of day, but was forged in the exhausted, pre-dawn hours, in the shared darkness of Phineas and Alara's bedroom. The ordeal had worn them down, eroding the foundations of their fortitude until only a raw, trembling fear remained. Their conversations had become circular, desperate journeys that always ended at the same wall of incomprehension. They had exhausted their own resources. Phineas's stern authority had proven as effective as shouting at the tide, and Alara's gentle love, once a balm for every childhood scrape and sorrow, was now a useless poultice on a wound that was not of the flesh. The final impetus came from the outside world, from the sting of a neighbor turning away too quickly at the market, the sound of children's voices hushing as their daughter walked by. They were becoming lepers, their family home a shunned and whispered about place. In the quiet of their room, with the faint, rhythmic sound of Violet's one-sided conversation, a constant, maddening pulse from down the hall, they came to an agreement. They would first turn to the world of reason, to the solid, empirical authority of medicine. The journey to the neighboring town of New Bedford, where the nearest reputable physician resided, was a somber and mostly silent affair. They borrowed a neighbor's wagon, a grudging favor granted with averted eyes, and set out at first light. The day was overcast and gray, the sky a flat, oppressive ceiling of bruised-looking clouds. The rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed dirt road was the only consistent sound, a metronome marking their slow progress away from the familiar and into the unknown. Alara sat in the back with Violet, holding her daughter's hand in a tight, desperate grip. Violet was placid, her body still, but her eyes constantly moving, scanning the passing woods and fields with an unnerving intensity, as if she were reading a script written upon the landscape that was invisible to everyone else. Her lips moved occasionally, a silent response to some unheard query. Phineas sat ramrod straight at the front, his knuckles white on the reins, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He was a man venturing into a foreign country, armed with a language he did not speak, to describe a map no one else could see. The shame of it was a physical weight on his shoulders, the public admission that he, as a father and as a man, had failed to protect his own household from an invader he could not even name. Dr. Alastair's practice was located on a respectable street lined with brick-fronted buildings, a world away from the simple wooden structures of their own township. The very air here seemed different, heavier with the smells of coal smoke, sea salt, and commerce. The doctor's examination room was a small, austere space, meticulously clean and organized, but utterly devoid of warmth or comfort. A tall, narrow window looked out onto a brick wall, admitting a weak, clinical light that seemed to strip the color from everything it touched. The air was cold and smelled sharply of carbolic acid and old dry paper. Along one wall stood a tall glass cabinet, its shelves lined with a terrifying array of polished steel instruments, forceps, scalpels, and strange, articulated tools whose purpose Phineas could not begin to imagine. They glinted in the gray light, symbols of a knowledge that was precise, cutting, and wholly alien to him. On a small table, a brass clock ticked with a loud, intrusive rhythm, each second a small metallic hammer striking the anvil of the room's oppressive silence. Dr. Alastair himself was a man who seemed to have been constructed from the same materials as his profession, dry, precise, and emotionally sterile. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild intellectual skepticism. He listened to Phineas and Alara's halting, disjointed account with his fingertips steepled together, his gaze moving between them, his eyes revealing nothing. As they spoke, their story, which was the very fabric of their terror-filled lives, began to sound thin and ridiculous. the ravings of uneducated, superstitious folk. The words voices and whispers seemed to lose their sinister weight in this bright, logical room, becoming instead the hallmarks of fantasy and delusion. Ilara found herself faltering, her voice trailing off as she described the nightly conversations, acutely aware of how insane it must sound. The doctor made no comment, simply making small, neat notes on a sheet of paper with a freshly sharpened quill. The scratching sound of the nib on the paper was a constant, irritating counterpoint to their pained testimony, the sound of their lived horror being reduced to a tidy, clinical summary. When their story was finished, a heavy silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the clock. The doctor then turned his attention to Violet, who had been sitting quietly on a wooden chair, her gaze fixed on a small water stain on the plaster wall. He beckoned her forward, his voice softened with a practiced, professional gentleness that held no genuine warmth. He led her to a tall leather examination chair that dominated the center of the room. He began his examination with a methodical, impersonal efficiency. He took her pulse, his cool fingers pressing against the delicate skin of her wrist. He listened to her heart and lungs with a cold, brass stethoscope, instructing her to breathe in and out in a calm, even voice. He peered into her eyes with a small, bright light, then into her ears and throat. Throughout the entire process, Violet remained utterly passive, a doll submitting to the manipulations of its owner. She did not speak, she did not resist. She seemed to regard the doctor and his instruments with a profound, almost regal indifference. Her body was present in the room, but her mind, her essence, was clearly elsewhere. The doctor then attempted to engage her in conversation. He asked her simple questions. He asked her name, her age, how she was feeling. Violet did not respond to him directly. Instead, after a long pause, she turned her head slightly and whispered something to the empty air just to the left of the doctor's shoulder. The words were too quiet to be understood, but the gesture was unmistakable. She was answering someone, but it was not the man of science who stood before her. Dr. Alistair's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, the first sign of any emotion he had shown. It was a flicker of professional annoyance. He tried again, his voice a little firmer, asking her what she saw on the wall she had been staring at. Violet turned her gaze back to the water stain and, after a moment, spoke her first and only clear words of the entire visit. She said that they were thirsty. The doctor stared at her, then at the wall, his rational mind searching for a logical connection and finding none. He asked her who was thirsty. Violet did not answer. She simply returned to her silence, a faint, secret smile playing on her lips. The examination was concluded. Dr. Alistair returned to his desk, the scratching of his quill resuming for a few final moments. He then delivered his verdict, his tone flat and definitive. He informed Phineas and Ilara that their daughter was in perfect physical health. Her heart was strong, her lungs were clear, her senses were acute. There was, he stated with unimpeachable confidence, nothing physically wrong with the child. He then leaned back in his chair and spoke of the delicate sensibilities of young girls, of the tendency toward vivid imagination and melancholic humors. He used the term hysteria, a word that hung in the air like a shroud, a vague and dismissive label for a mystery he had no desire to explore. He suggested that they cease filling her head with fanciful stories and ensure she had more exposure to sunlight and vigorous physical activity. As a final, dismissive gesture, he prescribed a simple iron tonic, a dark, viscous liquid in a small brown bottle, which he claimed would fortify her blood and calm her nerves. He then stood, a clear signal that the consultation was over. Phineas paid the man, the coins feeling heavy and useless in his hand. They had come seeking an answer, a name for the thief who was stealing their daughter. Instead, they had been given a diagnosis of foolishness and a bottle of dark syrup. The world of science had looked upon their nightmare and seen nothing more than a shadow. As they left the office and stepped back out into the gray afternoon, they were more alone than they had ever been. Their faith in reason shattered. They turned, as a last resort, to the authority of the divine. A week after the disastrous visit to the physician, Phineas rode to the parish and spoke in a low, urgent voice to the old priest, Father Michael. The priest, a man who had seen much of human suffering in his long life, listened with a grave and patient expression. He did not dismiss the story. He agreed to visit the Mercer homestead, bringing with him a younger, more zealous priest named Father Thomas. Their arrival a few days later was a stark and dramatic event. They appeared at the gate as the sun was setting, their long black cassocks dark, flapping shapes against the fiery colors of the sky. They carried with them a small wooden box containing the tools of their trade, a vial of holy water, a silver crucifix, a well-worn book of prayers. Their presence instantly transformed the atmosphere of the small house. The mundane air of the familiar rooms became charged with a solemn, ancient gravity. They asked to see Violet alone. Alara and Phineas waited in the kitchen, the sound of their own anxious breathing loud in the silence. They could hear the low, monotonous murmur of the priest's voices from Violet's room, a steady, rhythmic chanting of Latin prayers. The sound was meant to be comforting, a spiritual shield against the forces of darkness, but it only served to heighten their sense of dread. It was an admission that the battle being fought in their home was beyond the scope of human understanding. After what felt like an eternity, the two priests emerged from the bedroom, their faces serious and thoughtful. They sat with the parents at the small kitchen table, the last of the evening light casting long shadows across the room. Father Michael, the elder priest, spoke first. He told them that they had prayed over the child and blessed the room. He described Violet's demeanor during their visit. She had not recoiled from the crucifix. She had not flinched at the touch of holy water. She had simply watched them, her expression one of mild, detached curiosity. When they had asked her if she believed in God and his power to cast out demons, she had nodded without hesitation. But when Father Thomas, in his more direct and forceful manner, had commanded any unclean spirit present to name itself, Violet had only smiled. She had then looked at the young priest and told him that their names were like the sound of sand falling on a drum, and that there were too many to count. The answer was not defiant, it was not blasphemous. It was simply strange, a piece of poetic, unsettling imagery that offered no purchase for the traditional weapons of exorcism. The priest's conclusion was as devastating in its own way as the doctor's had been. They informed the Mercers that, while the girl's state was deeply troubling, she exhibited none of the classic, unequivocal signs of demonic possession. There was no supernatural knowledge, no violent aversion to sacred things, no hidden strength. The church, Father Michael explained, had to proceed with extreme caution in such matters. To perform the full rite of exorcism without definitive proof would be a grave spiritual error. They swore to Phineas and Alara that their daughter's soul appeared to be untouched, that she was not a vessel for a singular, malevolent entity. They could offer no explanation for the voices she heard, but they could not, in good conscience, declare her possessed. Their advice was prayer, constant and fervent prayer. They promised to add Violet to their own daily intentions, and then, with a final, somber blessing, they left, their dark forms swallowed by the gathering night. Phineas and Alara did not speak for a long time after the priests were gone. They sat in the deepening twilight of the kitchen, the silence of the house a crushing weight. They were now utterly and completely adrift. They had taken their terror to the two great pillars of their society, the clinic and the church. Science had offered them a tonic for the nerves and a diagnosis of feminine fancy. Faith had offered them prayers and a verdict of spiritual ambiguity. Both had looked at the abyss that had opened up in their family, and finding no familiar landmarks, had declared that it did not exist. They were left with an impossible reality. Their daughter was perfectly healthy, and her soul was not in peril, yet she was being consumed by an unseen, unheard legion. The authorities of the world had withdrawn, leaving the Mercer family isolated on a small, dark island, with the tide continuing to rise. The failure of these outside interventions served only to amplify the silent, screaming question that now lived in the center of their home. If what was happening to Violet was neither madness nor damnation, then what, in God's name, was it? The pronouncements of the doctor and the priests, intended to impose order, had the opposite effect. They created a vacuum. By declaring Violet to be neither physically ill nor spiritually possessed, they had stripped her condition of any known context, leaving it to fester in the dark, unnameable space between worlds. For Phineas and Alara, this was the cruelest blow. The authorities had not failed to cure their daughter. They had failed to even recognize that she was afflicted. They had held up the twin lamps of science and faith, and both had cast the same, empty light, revealing nothing. The Mercers were left alone with their terror, their suffering now officially invalidated, dismissed as a figment of their own overwrought, provincial imaginations. This dismissal, this profound and authoritative denial of their lived reality, was the spark that ignited the next, more terrible phase of Violet's transformation. She had been patient, she had been quiet, but now, faced with a world that refused to see or hear her torment, a new and brittle emotion began to harden within her, a deep, cold, and diamond-hard resentment. The shift was not from passivity to madness, but from a private struggle to a public war. If the world would not listen to her words, she would make it witness her suffering through her actions. Her body became her medium, the walls of the house her canvas. The first act of this new defiance was the refusal of food. It began subtly. A forkful of stew pushed around the plate, a piece of bread crumbled but not eaten. Alara, ever watchful, noticed immediately, her heart clenching with a familiar, sickening lurch. She would coax and plead, her voice a soft, desperate murmur. She spoke of the need to keep up her strength, of the love and care that had gone into preparing the meal. Her words were a gentle surf, breaking against a cliff of silent refusal. Violet would not argue. She would not even meet her mother's gaze. She would simply sit at the table, a small, unmoving effigy of denial, until the food on her plate had grown cold and congealed. Its comforting, nourishing warmth transformed into a symbol of their broken communion. Phineas, whose patience had been sanded away to a raw nerve, could not tolerate this new front of resistance. He saw it as a direct, insolent challenge to his authority as the provider and head of the household. He would command her to eat, his voice a low growl of contained fury. He told her that she would sit at that table until she had cleaned her plate, even if it took all night, and so she would. She would sit, silent and still, as the candles burned down, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. She and her father would be locked in a silent, epic battle of wills, Alara, a terrified spectator caught in the crossfire. Violet would not yield. She possessed a stillness, a depth of resolve that her father's anger could not penetrate. He would eventually give up, his rage collapsing into a weary, shuddering sigh of defeat. He would send her to her room, the untouched plate of food a monument to his powerlessness. The nightly ritual of the family meal, once the anchor of their day, became a source of exquisite torture, a quiet, dreadful theater of their disintegration. Violet grew thinner, the soft, childish roundness of her face giving way to a new and alarming angularity. Her skin became translucent, her eyes larger and darker in their hollowed sockets. She was visibly diminishing, a slow, deliberate act of self-erasure that her parents were forced to witness but were helpless to prevent. Then came the scratching. It began in the dead of night, a sound so faint at first that Phineas thought it was a mouse scrabbling behind the walls. It was a dry, furtive, rhythmic scraping. He rose from his bed, a candle in his hand, and traced the sound to its source, the other side of Violet's bedroom door. He stood for a long time, listening, the sound a persistent, unnerving whisper in the profound silence of the house. It was the sound of a prisoner trying to claw their way out, or the sound of something trying to claw its way in. When he finally pushed the door open, the sight that greeted him was one of focused, obsessive industry. Violet was standing on a small stool, her body pressed against the wall beside her window. Her nightdress was dusted with a fine, white powder. Her right hand was raised, her small fingers splayed, and she was systematically, deliberately scraping her fingernails across the plaster. The sound was a dry, rasping whisper. She was not frantic. Her movements were slow and methodical, like a scholar painstakingly erasing a line of text from a manuscript. He called her name, his voice a hoarse croak. She did not turn. She did not acknowledge his presence in any way. She simply continued her work, her entire being focused on the patch of wall before her. He crossed the room and gently took her arm, his touch causing a fine shower of plaster dust to fall to the floor. He tried to pull her away, but she resisted, her small body surprisingly strong, anchored to her task by a will that was no longer entirely her own. He finally had to lift her off the stool and carry her back to her bed. He looked at her hands. Her fingertips were raw, the nails broken and worn down to the quick. Small beads of blood mingled with the white dust, creating a pale pink paste under her ragged cuticles. He then looked at the wall. In the flickering candlelight, he could see the marks she had made. They were not random scratches. They were a dense, overlapping lattice of vertical and horizontal lines, a chaotic but seemingly deliberate pattern. It was a form of communication, a desperate physical graffiti that screamed of the invisible war being waged within her. He asked her, his voice breaking with a fear that was now absolute, what she was doing. She looked at her own bloody fingers with a strange detachment, as if they belonged to someone else. She then looked at the wall and whispered that they wanted to see the wood. They had told her the house was a box, and they needed to get out. From that night on, the scratching became a part of their lives, a new and terrible nocturnal rhythm. They would find new marks every morning, in different corners of her room, sometimes low to the floor, sometimes high up near the ceiling. The house, their home, began to feel like it was being unmade, its very skin being peeled away by its smallest, most fragile occupant. The atmosphere within the home grew thick with a fear that was almost liquid. Phineas and Alara began to move differently, their steps hesitant, their gestures furtive. They spoke in whispers, as if afraid of waking a sleeping predator. They were no longer simply afraid for their daughter. A new and more terrifying fear had begun to take root. They were afraid of her. They were afraid of the moments when her eyes would fix upon them with a cold, appraising look that held no trace of childish affection. They were afraid of the low, angry muttering that would sometimes erupt from her as she stared into a corner, a one-sided argument with an unseen antagonist. They were afraid of her new, unnatural strength, the wiry, unyielding power in her thin limbs when they tried to stop her from scratching at the walls. The humanizing detail of her childhood, her ability to find joy in small, quiet things, was now a distant, painful memory. That gentle child was gone, replaced by this strange, defiant creature who was a vessel for unseen forces and unknowable intentions. Alara's maternal instincts, which had always been a compass pointing toward comfort and protection, were now thrown into chaos. One evening, she found Violet in her room, whispering angrily at the wall she had been scratching. Tears streamed down Alara's face, a silent overflow of her helpless sorrow. She went to her daughter, intending to hold her, to wrap her in her arms, and somehow, through the sheer force of her love, drive out the darkness that had taken root. She reached out, her hand extended to stroke Violet's hair. But before she could make contact, Violet spun around, her face a mask of rage. She did not scream. She did not speak. She simply hissed, a low, guttural sound that was not human, a sound that came from the back of the throat, the sound of a cornered animal. Alara snatched her hand back as if she had been burned. She stared at her daughter, at the stranger looking out of her eyes, and for the first time, she felt a profound, instinctual terror. This was not her child. This was something else. Wearing her child's face, she backed away slowly, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest, and fled the room. The family's strange, self-imposed quarantine could not hold. The evidence of their internal decay began to seep out into the community. Phineas's appearances at the general store became less frequent. When he did go, he was a changed man. His shoulders, once broad and confident, were now slumped in a permanent posture of defeat. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed with a sleepless, haunted look. He would buy his supplies without meeting anyone's eye, his answers to polite inquiries curt and dismissive. The town, in turn, began to treat the Mercers as if they were a house in which the plague had taken hold. A subtle but unmistakable cordon of suspicion was drawn around them. Neighbors who had once shared gossip over a fence post now crossed the road to avoid passing their gate. The whispers that had once been confined to the schoolyard now flourished in every corner of the township. They were a dark, invasive weed, fueled by fear and ignorance. The narrative of madness began to take hold. People spoke of Violet's great aunt, a woman who was said to have died in a sanitarium many years ago, a story of dubious truth that was now resurrected as established fact. They said the taint was in the blood, a dormant poison that had now awakened in the child. Others preferred a more supernatural explanation. They spoke of a curse, of a bargain Phineas's grandfather had supposedly made with a dark entity to ensure a good harvest. They whispered that the debt was now coming due, that the girl was the payment. These stories, born of a need to explain the inexplicable, took on a life of their own. They became the accepted truth, a way for the community to categorize and thus contain the fear that the Mercers represented. By labeling Violet as either mad or cursed, they could place her outside the bounds of their own reality, making her a pitiable anomaly rather than a terrifying possibility. The family's isolation was now complete. They were not just alone with their horror. They were an island, surrounded by a sea of fearful, whispering judgment. Inside the besieged house, the core question of Violet's defiance became the central unspoken torture for her parents. Was she fighting the voices, or was she their instrument? Her resentful anger, the angry whispers they overheard, seemed to suggest a struggle. It was possible that the scratching, the refusal to eat, were her own desperate attempts to rebel, to exert some measure of control over a mind that was no longer her own. Perhaps she was resisting, fighting a war on a battlefield no one else could see, her destructive acts the only weapons at her disposal. This was the hope to which Alara clung, the fragile belief that her daughter was still in there, somewhere, fighting for her own soul. But there were other times, darker moments, that suggested a more terrifying alternative. There were the moments when a look of calm, serene understanding would pass over Violet's face as she listened to the silence. There were the intricate, almost deliberate patterns she scratched into the plaster, which seemed less like random acts of rage and more like the careful transcription of an unseen architect's plans. In these moments, Phineas was gripped by the chilling certainty that Violet was not resisting at all. She was obeying. She had become a loyal soldier in a foreign army, carrying out orders from a commander they could not hear. Her defiance was not directed at the voices. It was directed at them, at the world that sought to silence her only companions. She was not a prisoner fighting for freedom. She was a convert, protecting her new faith. This awful ambiguity was the true heart of their torment. They did not know if they were watching their daughter fight a desperate battle, or if they were watching her slowly, methodically, and willingly surrender. The pressure continued to build, the nightly scratching a constant, grinding erosion of their sanity, the daily battles over food, a slow starvation of their hope. The house could not contain the rising hysteria much longer. A single, freezing night was approaching, a night when the silent, simmering crisis would finally, violently boil over. The crisis, when it finally broke, arrived on the back of a bitter, northwesterly wind. It was a night in the deep heart of winter, a night so profoundly cold that the very air seemed to crackle and groan under the strain. The moon was a sliver of bone in a starless, ink-black sky, and the wind, a relentless, keening presence, threw handfuls of ice and snow against the windows of the Mercer homestead like a persistent, angry visitor demanding entry. Inside, the house was a small, embattled fortress of flickering candlelight against the vast, besieging darkness. Phineas and Alara sat at their kitchen table, a long accustomed silence hanging between them, thick and heavy as a shroud. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its warmth a feeble defense against the cold that seeped through the walls, a creeping, insidious chill that seemed to emanate not just from the outside, but from the very heart of the house itself. They had ceased speaking of hope. Their evenings were now spent in a state of shared, silent vigil, waiting for the next manifestation of the strangeness that had consumed their daughter and their lives. They were not waiting for a cure, but for a culmination. They did not have to wait long. It began with a sound that was different from the now familiar, rhythmic scraping. It was a single, sharp cry, a spike of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the mournful howl of the wind. The sound was thin and high-pitched, undeniably Violet's, but it was imbued with a quality they had never heard before: sheer, abject panic. Phineas and Alara froze, their heads snapping up, their eyes meeting across the worn wooden table. For a moment, they remained motionless, trapped in a tableau of disbelief and dread. Then, another scream followed, longer and louder this time, a raw, ragged sound that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of her. It was not a scream of defiance or anger. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment. The silence that had held them captive was shattered. Phineas kicked his chair back, its legs scraping harshly against the floorboards, and seized a heavy iron poker from the hearth. Alara, her face a pale mask of fear, grabbed the single oil lamp from the table, its flame casting wild, dancing shadows as she followed him. They moved down the narrow, frigid hallway, the wind shrieking outside, the sounds from Violet's room growing louder and more chaotic with every step they took. The screaming had now been joined by a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds, the sound of a body being thrown against a solid object. When Phineas reached the door, he did not hesitate. He threw it open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, the impact shaking the very frame of the house. The scene that confronted them was one of primal, terrifying chaos. The room was a maelstrom of motion and sound, a pocket of violent hysteria carved out of the cold, quiet night. Violet was in the center of the room, her small body a blur of frantic energy. She was thrashing, her limbs flailing, her head whipping from side to side, as if she were trying to dislodge something from within her own skull. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on a point of pure internal horror. She was screaming against the voices, her words a desperate, broken litany of refusal. They heard her shriek the word never, over and over again, a single, defiant syllable against an onslaught they could not perceive. She was beating her fists against her own head, her small hands striking her temples with a brutal, sickening force. Then, she would throw herself backward, her body slamming into the wall with a heavy, jarring thud, before she would stumble forward and begin the terrible cycle anew. Ilara let out a small, strangled cry, the lamp in her hand trembling violently. Phineas, his face grim and set, moved into the room. He called his daughter's name, his voice a low, urgent command, but it was swallowed by the storm of her hysteria. She did not see him. She did not hear him. She was lost, a sailor drowning in a tempest that raged entirely within her own mind. He lunged forward and caught her, wrapping his strong arms around her small, thrashing body. He was shocked by her strength. She fought against him with a wild, feral power, her muscles tense and unyielding. It was like holding onto a bolt of lightning. He held her tight, pinning her arms to her sides, absorbing the violent shudders that racked her frame. He could feel the frantic, machine gun tattoo of her heart against his own chest. Ilara, her paralysis broken by the need for action, set the lamp down on a small chest of drawers and rushed to his side. Together, they held their daughter, their bodies a physical cage against her self-destructive fury. Phineas murmured her name over and over, his voice a low, soothing chant, trying to provide an anchor in the storm. Slowly, agonizingly, the thrashing began to subside. The screams softened into ragged, gasping sobs. The wild energy drained away, leaving her limp and exhausted in their arms. She was still trembling, but the violent frenzy had passed, its terrible energy spent. In that moment, huddled together on the cold floor of their daughter's ruined room, a new and absolute certainty descended upon Phineas and Ilara. They had been wrong. The doctor, with his tonics and his talk of hysteria, had been wrong. Even the priests, with their cautious, measured pronouncements, had been wrong. This was not madness. This was not a troubled soul. This was a war. This was a siege. Their daughter was not a willing convert to a secret faith. She was a battlefield, and a violent, hostile force was attempting to overrun her last defenses. The night's terrible explosion was not an act of surrender, but an act of ultimate resistance. She had been fighting back. This realization, born in the crucible of that night's terror, swept away all their previous doubts and ambiguities. There was only one course of action left to them, one final desperate appeal to an authority they had previously found wanting. They needed the church, not for cautious prayers and blessings, but for war. Phineas left Ilara holding their now quiet daughter, a blanket wrapped around her trembling shoulders. He threw on his heaviest coat and plunged out into the screaming frozen night. The wind tore at him, stinging his face with ice and fury, but he barely felt it. He was driven by a singular, desperate purpose. He ran the entire distance to the parish house, his lungs burning, his feet stumbling on the frozen, uneven ground. He hammered on the heavy wooden door of the rectory, his fists a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the storm. After what seemed an eternity, the door creaked open, and the lined, sleep-softened face of Father Michael appeared, a candle held aloft in his hand. Behind him stood the younger, more intense Father Thomas, roused by the commotion. Phineas, gasping for breath, the words tumbling out of him in a torrent of cold air and raw fear, told them what had happened. He spoke of the screaming, the violence, the desperate, terrified resistance he had witnessed in his daughter. He did not ask for their help. He demanded it. He told them that their caution was no longer acceptable, that their definitions and distinctions were meaningless in the face of the raw, violent reality that was tearing his family apart. Something in his wild-eyed desperation, in the undeniable weight of his terror, broke through the priest's professional reserve. They saw in him not a superstitious peasant, but a man who had stared into the abyss. Without a word, Father Michael nodded, his expression now one of grave, solemn resolve. They gathered what they needed, their movements swift and purposeful. The small wooden box of sacred instruments was brought out once more. This time, however, they also brought a heavy, leather-bound volume, its pages edged in faded gold, the Rituale Romanum, the ancient and authorized text containing the formal rite of exorcism. The journey back to the Mercer homestead was a grim, silent procession against the storm. The wind howled around them like a chorus of damned souls, as if the very elements were protesting their holy errand. When they entered the house, they found Alara sitting on the floor of Violet's room, cradling the girl in her lap. Violet was quiet now, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She seemed to be in a state of profound exhaustion, a fragile truce having settled over the battlefield of her mind. The priests did not hesitate. They began their work with a focused, almost military precision. Father Thomas, the younger and more vigorous of the two, took the lead. He began by lighting blessed candles, their clean, steady flames a stark contrast to the flickering, chaotic light of the oil lamp. He filled the room with the thick, acrid smoke of incense, its scent clinging to the cold air, a spiritual fumigation designed to drive out any unclean presence. The atmosphere in the small bedroom was transformed. It was no longer just a child's room. It had become a sanctuary, a sacred space, a consecrated ground for a spiritual battle. Father Michael began the litany of the saints, his voice a low, steady murmur, a foundation of prayer upon which the rite would be built. Father Thomas then opened the heavy book and, in a loud, clear voice that resonated with an authority that was not his own, began the rite of exorcism. He spoke in Latin, the ancient, holy language of the Church, its powerful, polysyllabic words filling the room. He sprinkled holy water on Violet, on the walls, in the corners of the room where the shadows were deepest. As he began the formal adjurations, commanding the entity to depart, Violet's body tensed. A low growl emanated from her throat, a sound of pure, animalistic fury. Her eyes snapped open, but the eyes that stared back at the priests were not those of a 9-year-old girl. They were ancient and filled with a profound, chilling malevolence. She began to thrash again, her strength renewed, her movements now imbued with a sinister, unnatural purpose. She fought against her mother's hold, her small body arching and contorting. The battle was joined. For what felt like hours, the small room was the epicenter of a titanic struggle. The priest's voice, rising in volume and intensity, was a relentless, hammering assault of sacred words. He held the silver crucifix aloft, a beacon in the incense-choked air, and pressed it against Violet's forehead. A scream, a sound of pain and rage that was impossibly deep and resonant for such a small child, erupted from her lips. The house itself seemed to groan under the strain of the spiritual violence being enacted within its walls. The wind outside rose to a fever pitch, rattling the window panes as if in a furious, impotent rage. Violet's voice changed, shifting from her own to a chorus of whispers, a multitude of voices speaking at once from her mouth, a sound like dry sand and broken glass. They mocked the priest, they cursed his faith, they spoke of ancient, forgotten things. But the priests did not waver. Father Michael continued his steady, supporting prayers, his presence a calm, solid anchor in the storm. Father Thomas, his face beaded with sweat, his own voice growing raw, pressed on, his faith an unyielding weapon. He repeated the holy names of God, of Christ, of the Virgin Mary, each name a blow against the entity that held the child in its grip. He commanded it, by the power of the Church and the blood of the Lamb, to release its hold, to depart into the outer darkness. The struggle reached a crescendo. Violet's body arched so violently that it seemed her spine would snap. A final, unearthly shriek filled the room, a sound of ultimate defeat and despair. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Her body went limp, collapsing back into her mother's arms. The malevolent light in her eyes faded, replaced by the soft, unfocused gaze of a tired child. A deep, profound peace descended upon the room. The wind outside died down to a low, mournful whisper. The battle was won. Violet's breathing became deep, and even the peaceful rhythm of natural sleep. The two priests stood, exhausted but triumphant, their cassocks damp with sweat and holy water. They looked at the sleeping child, her face now serene and untroubled for the first time in years. They had met the enemy, and, through the power of their faith, they had cast it out. They offered a final, quiet prayer of thanks, and then, with a few soft words of reassurance to the weeping, grateful parents, they departed, leaving the scent of incense and victory lingering in the frozen air. Phineas and Alara watched them go, their hearts overflowing with a relief so profound it was physically painful. They looked at their daughter, sleeping peacefully. The storm finally passed. They dared to hope. They dared to believe that their long nightmare was over, that the silence in their daughter's mind was now a clean, empty space, finally her own once more. For the first time in years, the Mercer family slept through the night, a deep, dreamless, and healing sleep, blissfully unaware that the victory they were celebrating was a hollow one, and that the enemy had not been vanquished, but had merely executed a strategic retreat. The aftermath of the exorcism was a period of profound and deceptive tranquility. The silence that settled over the Mercer homestead was not the heavy, anxious quiet of the preceding years, but a clean, empty stillness that felt like a gift from God. The wind that had raged on the night of the ritual had scoured the sky, leaving behind a world encased in pristine, glittering ice, the sunlight on its surface almost blinding in its brilliance. It was a world reborn, and for a few, fleeting days, Phineas and Alara allowed themselves to believe that their family had been reborn with it. The house, which had for so long felt like a besieged fortress, a place of shadows and fearful whispers, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The air itself felt lighter, cleansed of the oppressive, watchful presence that had been its most constant occupant. The scratches on the plaster walls, once a source of terror, now seemed like scars from a battle long past, a testament to a victory that had been hard won. Violet herself was transformed. She slept for nearly 18 hours after the priests departed, a deep, restorative sleep that seemed to wash away the years of torment. When she finally awoke, the change in her was startling. The haunted, angular look was gone from her face, replaced by a soft, childlike serenity. The dark, knowing intensity in her eyes had vanished, and in its place was a clear, calm gaze that seemed to see the world for the first time. She was quiet, but it was a natural, peaceful quiet, not the unnerving, listening silence of before. She began to eat again, her appetite small at first, but growing stronger with each meal. She spoke, her voice still weak and a little hoarse, but it was her own. She asked for a drink of water, She commented on the brightness of the Sunday. Each simple, ordinary sentence was a miracle to her parents, a melody more beautiful than any hymn. They moved around her with a hushed, reverent tenderness, afraid that a loud noise or a sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace that had descended. For 3 days, the miracle held. Violet remained calm and present, her mind seemingly her own. She did not whisper to corners. Her gaze did not drift to some unseen point in the middle distance. She sat with her mother in the kitchen, her hands idle but relaxed in her lap, watching the slow, familiar rhythm of domestic life, as if it were a strange and fascinating new play. She followed her father to the woodpile, her steps a little unsteady, and watched him split logs, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips at the clean, satisfying crack of the wood. The nightly conversations, the scratching, the arguments with the unseen, all of it had ceased. The silence from her room at night was now a source of profound comfort, a confirmation that she was truly, finally alone in her own mind. Phineas and Alara began to sleep again, a deep, restful sleep untroubled by the need for anxious vigil. They spoke to each other in quiet, hopeful tones, their conversations no longer revolving around their daughter's affliction, but around the future, a future they had not dared to imagine for years. They allowed the seeds of a new life, a normal life, to begin to germinate in the fallow ground of their hearts. The change began on the 4th day. It was so subtle at first that they almost missed it, their minds conditioned by hope to ignore any evidence that might contradict their newfound peace. Violet was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-eaten bowl of porridge before her. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was staring into the light, her expression placid. Then, her lips moved. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, a brief pursing, a silent shaping of a word that was never spoken. Alara, who was standing at the hearth, saw it out of the corner of her eye. Her heart gave a single, painful jolt, a sharp, cold jab of her old, familiar fear. She told herself it was nothing, a twitch, a random muscular spasm. She turned her full attention to Violet, watching her with an intensity that was sharp and painful. For a long time, nothing happened. Violet remained still, her face serene. Alara began to breathe again, chastising herself for her lingering paranoia. The beast had been cast out, it was gone. But then it happened again. This time, it was more definite. Violet's lips moved, forming a clear, silent yes. Her head gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. There was no sound, no whisper, but the gesture was unmistakable. It was a response. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. The kitchen, which had felt so warm and safe a moment before, suddenly seemed to grow cold, the shadows in the corners deepening. She looked at her daughter, at the serene expression on her face, and she knew. The silence had been a lie. It was not an empty room. It was a room where the occupants had learned to be quiet. Over the next few days, the silent conversations became more frequent. Violet would be engaged in some simple activity, her focus apparently on the task at hand, when her lips would begin their secret, silent dance. She would offer a silent reply, a brief, fleeting smile, a small, almost invisible shrug. She was once again engaged in a dialogue, but it was a dialogue that had evolved. It was no longer a torment. There was no evidence of the struggle and resistance that had culminated in the violent hysteria of the exorcism. Her responses now were calm, easy, and familiar. She had the placid, comfortable air of someone listening to a constant companion, a voice that was now as natural and integral to her as the sound of her own breathing. The priests, in their violent holy war, had not banished the voices. They had simply silenced the argument. They had not cast out the enemy. They had, in their ignorance, presided over the signing of a peace treaty, a final, unconditional surrender. Phineas and Alara watched this new, quiet horror unfold with a despair that was deeper and more profound than any they had known before. Their brief, sunlit period of hope made the return of the darkness all the more unbearable. They had been given a glimpse of the daughter they had lost, only to have her snatched away again, this time with a terrifying finality. This new phase was worse than the scratching, worse even than the screaming. The old struggle had been terrible, but at least it had been a sign that their daughter was still fighting. This new, placid acceptance was a sign that the fight was over and that she had lost. They realized the awful truth of the exorcism. The ritual had not been a purification, it had been a negotiation. The screaming and the thrashing had been Violet's last stand, her final, desperate attempt to repel the invaders. The church, with its holy water and its Latin commands, had not aided her in her fight. It had simply overwhelmed her, breaking her will to resist, leaving her defenseless and open to the final, complete occupation of her mind. The voices had not been driven out. They had simply been invited to stay, their victory now absolute and uncontested. Violet stopped speaking to her parents altogether. She no longer responded to their questions. She no longer acknowledged their presence with anything more than a brief, indifferent glance. Her physical body remained in their house, but her spirit, her consciousness, had migrated to another realm, a world that was populated by the silent voices to which she now gave her complete and undivided attention. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent, hollowed-out vessel. Her world had shrunk to the space between her own ears, a landscape of constant, unheard conversation. She would sit for hours by the window, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line, her lips moving in a perpetual, silent colloquy. The expressions that crossed her face were a reflection of the unheard conversation, a flicker of amusement, a shadow of concentration, a brief, thoughtful frown. She was more animated, more engaged with her unseen companions than she had ever been with her own family. Her parents' fear curdled into a kind of living grief. They were mourning a child who was still alive, a daughter who sat before them but was, in every way that mattered, gone. They no longer tried to intervene. They had no weapons left. Science had failed them. Faith had betrayed them. Their own love had proven useless. They simply continued with the motions of their lives around her, a small, broken family orbiting a silent, empty center. The neighbors, seeing Violet calm and quiet, assumed the priest's intervention had been a success. They saw the absence of overt madness and called it a cure. The Mercers did not correct them. They had no words to describe the quiet, insidious horror of what had actually happened. How could they explain that the peace everyone saw was, in fact, the most profound and terrible evidence of their defeat? And so, Violet Mercer lived out the rest of her short life. She became a town legend, the strange, silent girl who was never seen without a faint, secret smile on her lips, as if she were perpetually enjoying a joke that no one else was privy to. She was an object of pity and a whispered cautionary tale, but no one ever knew the truth. No one ever knew that her silence was not emptiness, but a space filled with a cacophony of voices that no prayer could ever drive away. Her mind was a locked room, and the door had been sealed not by demons, but by the very men who had come to save her. What the voices wanted, what they had finally claimed in their silent, complete victory, remained a mystery. They had come as whispers, faint and indistinct as dripping water, and they had stayed, becoming the very river that carried her soul away into a land of silence from which she would never return. The record on Violet Mercer is now complete. We are grateful for your presence here, as we bear witness to these echoes from the past. If these chronicles of the forgotten speak to you, Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive so you are with us when the next file is unsealed. Tell us in the comments what you believe became of the girl who couldn't escape the voices in her head.